Here's where it starts getting very interesting.
If anyone has heard about Pakal or his tomb, they may have heard this idea of the Palenque spaceman.
And we're seeing what look to be interesting elements of Mesoamerican thought right here in the text of the Book of Mormon.
Again, it makes me think of Lehi's dream.
Well, that's interesting because the Book of Mormon in 7 places talks about. Hello, friends. This is Kirk Magleby. This is Discover the Book of Mormon. And we're very privileged today to have in the studio as our guest, Mr. Daniel Johnson. Comes to us from the faculty of North Georgia University in the greater Atlanta area. Many ancient cultures were fixated. They were completely consumed with the idea of life, death, and life after death. And we see that in the Egyptian civilization. We see it throughout the Chinese civilization. And one of the places where this comes through loud and clear and so significantly is in Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico.
Right, Palenque, Mexico. Beautiful sight.
Oh, it's amazing. I've been there many times.
I've only been there once.
One of the most beautiful sights you can possibly imagine from antiquity. And what's interesting about Palenque is the quality of the epigraphy, the iconography.
Yeah, there's some really, really great carvings of the glyphs, the images of rulers, captives, and wonderful artwork there, and it's in good condition. A lot of it survived really well.
Because of the nature of the limestone right here at Palenque, this is beautiful art that's survived through the centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. The wonderful stuff, and the museum at Palenque is worth a visit.
Oh, my heavens. One of the very best in all the Americas. So what can you tell us about the famous Pakal?
Pakal, perhaps the most known, at least in modern times, ruler of the ancient Maya, as far as an ancient Mayan king. Really famous. He ruled for a long time at Palenque. By the way, since we're talking about Palenque, we should kind of have a little run through about it and see some images and kind of see what it's like. Beautiful place. I'd love to be able to return. One thing to know is that most of these sites, they don't have their original names. Palenque is a Spanish name. It means palisade.
Yeah.
And so some of the sites, we have no idea what they were named in their initial history. You know, what the
Maya would have called that site.
Exactly. And so sometimes the names are given in modern times by archaeologists. It's with a few we know what their name was, and anciently Palenque was known as Lakamha, which means great water. And there is so much water at Palenque. There are rivers running through it. The great palace had channels of water going through, running water, and really
aqueduct systems.
Exactly. Great technology and engineering went into that. So so Lakamha is how it would have been known to the Maya who actually lived there. And we have some wonderful and unique examples of some architecture there, and we don't really see anywhere else. That's what we're going to talk about, especially with Pakal. If anyone knows of a Mayan king or anything about the burial of a Mayan king, it would probably be about Pakal. He had a really interesting acropolis and palace, and there's a tower that was built there that was part of that sort of whole structure, the royal structure. Really interesting. We don't quite see that anywhere else in the Maya world.
No, that is absolutely unique anywhere in the Americas.
Yeah,
and it could have been an observatory, could have been a lookout.
Yeah, all sorts of things. And so many of these things we don't know exactly perhaps what they meant to the people who built them. We're kind of guessing and speculating. But here we have the Temple of the Inscriptions. And this is really well known because this is the tomb of Pakal. It's known as the Temple of the Inscriptions because, and hopefully people know this, but the temple itself is this little building on top. The pyramid, the structure it sits on, represents a mountain. It's a symbolic mountain. And so the temple is at the top of the mountain. And this temple here, we have what is, I believe, the longest continuous Mayan text carved in stone. Epigraphers are reading it, they're deciphering it, and they're finding all kinds of fascinating things about the Maya, their history, their beliefs, and of course the dynasty here at Pakal, or at Palenque. And so what's famous about this particular site is that it is the burial place, and perhaps the only time where we know of that the Maya built this sort of pyramid with the idea of the burial there around for this king of theirs. And so there was really well-known Mexican archaeologist, and that was Alberto Ruz. And in the temple at the top, the flooring he noticed that one of the stones had some sort of curious holes carved in the actual stone that made the floor. And so he was able to put something in there and pry it out and notice there was a passageway going down that had been completely filled with rubble. It took him and his team a number of seasons to clear it out. When they'd gone down deep inside the pyramid, they found the tomb of Pakal the Great, sometimes we call him. And this was in 1952. So Pakal's tomb is one of the big reasons to know about Palenque and the sites here, and really some fascinating stuff.
And this is generally considered the finest example of an ancient American artifact anywhere in the hemisphere.
And we're talking about his tomb, particularly the sarcophagus lid. And that's really where we want to go with this, because it's really famous, really well known. And so many of the buildings and sites around Palenque are really beautiful. Just very close to his temple, his burial site, the Temple of the Inscriptions, we have what's known as the Cross Group, a series of 3 temples that are nearby. And there's this idea of this sort of triad of gods at Palenque. It was very important. The number 3 also is really important to the Maya. There were 3 hearthstones of creation the gods put together to create the world as we know it, the universe. And there was a triad of 3 gods that were really important to the Maya at Palenque. And we're still trying to figure out what the Maya all believed, but that's kind of where we want to get into here. Is if anyone has heard about Pakal or his tomb, they may have heard this idea of the Palenque spaceman or astronaut. It does seem a bit strange to kind of think about that. It was an idea popularized. It goes back to a Swiss author and investigator, if you will, named Erich von Däniken, that became popular with a book called Chariots of the Gods quite a long time ago. And those ideas are still around, still very popular, and you can see all kinds of things about ancient aliens today. So if we look at the sarcophagus lid of Pakal's tomb, it's this huge singular piece of carved stone, really heavy.
7
weight on that?
tons.
7 tons. And when the archaeologists got down to the tomb itself, it's a really small, kind of cramped area there, and this was covering it. Incredible, perhaps one of the most amazing pieces of Maya artwork that we have today in, I think, its scope, its size, its detail, and its significance. And it's just beautiful. Of course,
So why on earth did people think this was an example of ancient aliens coming down to abduct a human?
people, well, one person in particular, and then it grew from there. I think it's because they tried to interpret what's on this lid here, the sarcophagus lid. And perhaps one thing we can all agree on is there is a person there, and that does represent Pakal himself. And he reigned nearly 70 years as king at Palenque, and was really involved in his funeral preparations, in the creation of his tomb, his sarcophagus, the pyramid, and all that. But we have this, that's him, and maybe that's the one thing we could agree on in a rather unusual position. But what von Däniken originally thought he saw was someone at the controls of a rocket or a spaceship, if you can believe it. So that behind him, if we look, say, to the right side, is, say, the exhaust and thrust of a rocket. His unusual position is like in the cramped confines of a capsule. His feet seem to be hitting something. His hands are doing something. And then we have this object going in front of him. Well, that's all fine and good. So this was
right after 52. We're in the 50s. We're in the early 60s.
Yes.
This is when space travel is beginning to be a big thing. We've got the Mercury program, the Gemini program.
Yeah, and for
so he's just playing into that popular interest in space travel.
It could be. And for some reason, the ancient alien theorists are always seeing 1960s technology. Delta-winged airplanes, helicopters, submarines are the things they often see. And so the trick is, how do you interpret something like this? Just to look at it and say, it looks to me like this, based on my cultural bias and context, might not really work for what the Maya were believing, a completely different culture, and with our own unique set of beliefs and history and all that. But I think what's really important to be able to do is look at something in the context of the people who created it. And so if we see that, the thing we want to focus on is that sort of cross-shaped item, often called the Mayan cross, which pops up over and over in Mayan art all over the place in many, many cities in the Mayan area.
And we believe it's really a tree, right?
Yeah, that's the idea. Is it is a tree, and what makes more sense for this thing to be? And I got to think too that this great king, as he has the preparations for all his sort of burial setup, what's on his mind, right? Is it sitting in a rocket ship going to the stars, or is it something else that everyone thinks of facing that day of his own death, right? So as we mentioned the cross group, and there's a temple in there called the Temple of the Cross, and this is it right here. If you go inside, what you'll see is there's a carving on the wall there. That's the main feature of this temple, and we can't really see the details very much at the moment. So if I kind of pull those out a little bit, we see that's the exact same symbol.
Okay, so I'm seeing the very same tree
Yes.
sculpted on the cross panel at the top of the Temple of the Cross that I'm seeing on the sarcophagus lid of Pakal's tomb.
Yes, it's obviously the same imagery, same iconography, and we can see it's meant to be going upright. It is a tree after all, and there are a lot of other similar bits of symbolism, iconography. It's really the exact same thing from the bottom up, and we're going to take a look at the actual symbolism on Pakal's tomb and see what it was that he was thinking about. And this is really sort of the best idea we have today of Mayan epigraphers and archaeologists and historians as far as studying this, reading the writings, which they can do now, and also
We've
looking
been able
at
to read Mayan since about the early 70s.
Yeah, the breakthroughs in being able to read the hieroglyphs were really, really fascinating.
And it's interesting that it was here at Palenque where the first breakthroughs happened with Peter Matthews, with Linda Sheely, with that group.
And again, we have some, if you think about it, I mean, writing and art and symbolism and religious imagery are kind of all the same thing. And so if we've got the best materials, and if they're in the best condition at Palenque, then that leaves us the best opportunity to try and figure out what they were really trying to say. So if we look at the very bottom part of this, we're going to start there and sort of work our way up on Pakal's sarcophagus lid. And what we have here is obviously a face. There are many ways we can look at this. This is the earth monster. It's a frightful type of being or idea. The Mayan underworld or land of death was known as Xibalba. And as all mortal beings, they feared this land and were looking for a way to escape it. And what we see here is this frightful monster that is death, really, reaching out to sort of grab and entrap Pakal as he is dying and falling into it.
So he is literally sort of bringing his clutches around Pakal.
Right. So if anyone, at the moment of their death might feel that way, that's, I think, what he was feeling, and he has it here sort of immortalized in stone, the clutches, and even sort of like serpentine shape reaching out to grab him and, keep him in this land of death. And especially like the Maya royalty, he's looking for a way to escape that. As he believes all his ancestors have done in the past, he wants to escape the land of death and be reborn or resurrected and be with the deities and his ancestors.
So what is the way he's going to escape the clutches of the death monster?
Well, it's a really, really good question, something that seems to occupy the minds of not just Pakal, but almost every Maya king. And so as we move our way up, what we see here is known as a sacrificial plate. So we see the idea of sacrifice, and the Maya kings and royalty would often use themselves as a type of
So that's where the bloodletting ritual comes from.
Exactly. They would use, and this little item kind of right in the middle pointing upward is a stingray spine. And that's one of the items they would use to pierce themselves, tongue, other regions, to bleed. And that was part of the debt and the responsibility of a king to give his own blood.
So it was the king's responsibility then to sacrifice on behalf of his people.
Yes, because he was believed to be divine, and his divine blood was what was needed. And so that went into an important bit of what of a ritual the kings did. We'll maybe mention that in a moment. But we have this sort of sacrificial plate, and there's a Mayan glyph right in the middle. It's called Kin, and it means the sun. And so it's sort of this X shape, and we have that seen over and over. And sometimes the deities have that in their name. Sometimes we have the kings will take that. But this idea of the sun appears over and over. So as we move up, we see him in this unusual position. And this actually is a position of birth. what's happening here. It's so we have this rebirth, and it could be also that it was two things. Is he falling into the clutches of death, or is he escaping and heading out, as he's hoping that this rebirth will save him from death?
He could either be being brought down into death, or he could be raised up to life and to the heavens.
And perhaps both, right? But we see here he's I'm not sure if he's falling in or escaping, but he certainly hopes to escape it. And we see the last bits of these sort of serpentine arms of the earth monster that are kind of trying to hold him in death. And there are a couple of items that he's wearing that are going to be really important here. One is the jade skirt. So he's got a jade skirt, and he also has a pectoral, or it's like a breastplate piece right here that symbolizes
like a large medallion that you'd wear like a necklace.
Right, and so it's a tortoise. And so these are both symbols of the Maize God. So the Maize God really features into Mayan mythology and the religion and early history. But the idea is that this was a god that was brought down to the world of death and was killed and was rescued by the hero twins. And as he arose out of the earth and was resurrected, he grew into a tree, this world tree that we see symbolized here and that the Maya sort of looked for. So how is he going to escape the clutches of death? He's hoping to take this path that has already been done before by the Maize God, by his ancestors, and be reborn out of the clutches of death and sort of resurrect and ascend up this world tree.
So there's a path by which I can either go down to death or I can go up to heaven.
Well, perhaps so. And the interesting thing about this world tree is it's also seen as kind of the beginning of Maya creation. And it links these three worlds. The roots go down to the underworld, the land of the death. And then the trunk is visible in the mortal world. And it rises up and spreads out to the heavens and attaches the heavens. So it links the three realms. We have the celestial, the mortal, earthly, and then the land of the dead underneath. And this tree connects them all.
What is there interesting about the actual trunk of the tree now that's representing mortality or the terrestrial world that we live in?
Right. So as we look at this tree here, it's got symbols on it that represent mirrors. And so
like an obsidian mirror?
Obsidian and any kind of shiny surface that they could make, they could polish and make it smooth and shiny and bright. So the tree itself has symbols that show that it is bright and is shiny. And it maybe just kind of a coincidence that it takes a cross shape that we, from a Western point of view, would recognize. But we see the shape over and over again, not just at Palenque, but in many Maya sites. And the Maya kings were really anxious to associate themselves with this symbol. It was not only a symbol of, say, the salvation from death, which we've been talking about, but also their authority as kings. In fact, the kings wanted to even sort of see themselves becoming this tree. So we see that right here. We see that the tree ends in various interpretations, bearded serpents, something with ornamentation or jewelry. What we find is that the more we study the Mayan language and Mayan iconography, we learn more about it. And sometimes what we thought a while ago has to kind of get discarded in favor of the latest thinking. So sometimes in some ways the interpretation is evolving a bit.
So there's a double-headed serpent at the top of this tree. What's the interesting aspect or significance of a double-headed serpent?
Well, let's take a look at that. So we can see that kind of blocked out right there, the serpent, and it has so many really important meanings and symbolism for the Maya. The serpent is kind of seen as in the world of the dead, in the earthly world, and in the celestial world. It becomes a path and a kind of a means to escape from death. But also, as I mentioned, the Maya kings doing their bloodletting, a common thing they would do is they would pierce their bodies, let the blood fall on bits of paper, and they would burn that in a ceremony.
And then that paper would rise as a sort of smoke.
Right. So as the smoke rises, I've seen carvings and depictions of this. It turns into what they call a vision serpent.
That's very, very prominent at Yaxchilan.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Some really, really good carvings at Yaxchilan. And so we have this vision serpent, and then the serpent will open its mouth, and often there will be an ancestor or some type of celestial being that will give revelation.
Okay, so this serpent is the means by which the earthly Pakal, as the Kuhulakau, or Ahau, this divine Lord
Divine King.
will be able to receive revelation on behalf of his people.
Right. And so the serpent is all over, and for them it was a positive thing. Often from a Christian point of view or the Western point of view, we think of the serpent as evil. And I know some people that can't stand snakes at all, right? But for the Maya, the serpent had these important qualities, kind of like it could link them to the other world, and where they could receive instruction and divine information, and sort of like help them be with the gods.
Okay, so the serpent is symbolizing both a path up and down as well as a conduit for revelation.
Exactly. And so it's not unusual to see the serpent just all over the place in all sorts of carvings, of paintings, and there's usually some sort of divine element that's associated with it.
And then what do we have above the serpent and the tree, up in the branches?
Well, as we look at the top, there are these odd sort of three-part symbols, and these are known as kulel, or sacredness, or preciousness. And so they're all sort of permeating this upper space here, which is very interesting. So again, understanding Mayan iconography and the written language, we can now see what these strange symbols are trying to tell us, rather than just kind of using our own cultural bias to try and interpret them. But these symbols of sacredness are all around, scattered among the tree. And as we head to the top of the tree, this is a common bit of imagery, not just for the Maya, but really all over Mesoamerica and even into Mexico and other cultures. We have a bird sitting on top of the tree. We see a lot of these same symbols.
So when I see the Mexican flag and I've got a bird on top of a cactus, same kind of an idea.
Very much so. Of course, that comes from the Aztec, and it was a legend about how they found their capital city. But again, a bit of like a divine symbol showing that was a place for them. But what we have here is this celestial bird. It's also shown in the Temple of the Cross, and it represents a powerful creator deity known as Itzamna. Some of it associate this bird with the Quetzal. And if you hear the word Quetzal, you might think of a deity called Quetzalcoatl. And so that is an Aztec or Nahuatl name for a deity known as Kukulkan to the Maya. But this deity combines these sort of seemingly opposite attributes of a bird, of like avian qualities, with a serpent. They're coming together in this one deity.
Well, that's interesting because the Book of Mormon in 7 places talks about raising a brazen serpent and people looking upon that brazen serpent and getting healed.
Fascinating, especially because we have this idea of the serpent being a symbol of evil, but yet going back to the Old Testament, Moses created that brazen serpent for the exact purpose of healing his people who had been bitten by these fiery serpents.
Flying serpents. They're literally a flying serpent.
Yeah, so there's that flying serpent again. It's such an interesting combination. Why would that imagery be in the Old Testament and then a really common thing all over Mesoamerica and even in the Americas beyond just the borders of Mesoamerica?
Okay, so you've talked to us about the 3 layers of the cosmos that Pakal is negotiating. He's been in the underworld, he died, and now he's in the process of rebirth and resurrection and climbing up this world tree and hoping to go become divine, hoping to go be part of the celestial glory.
Exactly. And so this bird, or this representation of a deity, is perhaps the entrance into that divine realm. And then encircling the entire scene that we've talked about is a sort of celestial sky band. And it has symbols of the sun, of the moon, of stars, all these sort of great sort of cosmology in the Mayan way of thinking is encircling this whole sort of narrative that Pakal is telling. And he's also including in this celestial sky band some important dignitaries, or maybe even close friends from his court. One of them at the very top has a title carved there, which is called Keeper of the Holy Books. And what's interesting, we're not seeing it here, but if you were to turn and look at the sides of the sarcophagus, you would see portraits of Pakal's ancestors. And it shows them coming out of a crack in the earth and rising as a flowering tree. And what that means is those are all symbols of resurrection and the Maize God, that they have died. And also interesting is that there's a term used quite often over and over in the writings we have in his tomb, that for when someone dies, in Mayan, the term is och be, or och be, which means he entered the path.
Enters the path.
Yes. And so that's with all of his ancestors, it'll list the person, he entered the path, it will give him the date of his death, and it's shown as a person rising again, reborn as a divine being.
Let's go to the Book of Mormon now and see what it can tell us about these sorts of concepts.
Absolutely.
First of all, how often does the term death and resurrection appear in the Book of Mormon?
I haven't counted, but I'm going to imagine quite a bit.
The word death appears 227 times
Okay.
in the text of the Book of Mormon. And there's what's called the bands of death. So how would the bands of death relate to what we just saw? That's where this earth monster is trying to grab onto Pakal and keep him down.
And he wants to find a way to escape.
And he wants
these.
a way to escape the bands of death.
Yes.
All right, the word grave appears 22 times in the text. The word hell 59 times. And the word resurrection 81 times. So death and resurrection is a massive theme throughout the Book of Mormon. We then have, notice that there's a tree of life here.
Yes.
The word tree appears 133 times in the text of the Book of Mormon. And the tree of life itself, that phrase, those three words, tree of life, appears 16 times. Life is in there 145 times. Eternal life is 25 times. So tree, life, eternal life, massively important in the text of the Book of Mormon. And then there's this concept of healing associated with the tree. There's the raising, and Jesus Christ himself goes in and says, I was raised up that I can raise up all men and bring men unto me. So the raising is both from the dead, lots of examples of people being raised from the dead in the Book of Mormon. And then there's also this notion that in the end times, we will be raised up to judgment. And that's how, as we're resurrected, we will go before Jesus Christ and account for our sins, be called to judgment. And then born again is talked about 7 times in the text. So there's this concept of rebirth that's there. But even more interestingly, as far as the cultural connections to the Book of Mormon, we have in 2 Nephi chapter 9, verse 10, oh, how great the goodness of our God, who prepareth a way for our escape from the grasp of this awful monster, yea, that monster, death and hell.
When you're reading that, I could envision that bottom part of Pakal's sarcophagus lid exactly. That's what he could be thinking.
So here's 2 Nephi 9:19. For he delivereth his saints from that awful monster, the devil and death and hell. And then go on to verse 26, that they are delivered from that awful monster, death and hell. So the Book of Mormon seems to be fairly consistent with what we've just seen as far as the bottom layer of this iconography. Now, one thing that we didn't actually point out in the presentation is Pakal has a little floral breath bead right here at the junction of his nostrils and his lip.
Yeah, there's something coming right there. And since you mentioned that, I've heard these sort of ancient alien hypothesis saying that is like a breathing tube or an oxygen, right?
Yeah, like you see a fighter pilot will put on his oxygen mask.
Exactly. But the thing is, when a man's facing his death, what's he really thinking about? So what would this bead by the nose or the mouth be?
Well, in the Book of Mormon, breath and life are synonymous. Mm-hmm. So God gives you breath, and that's why you live. In the ancient Mesoamerican cultures, a breath bead was very often placed right here, right under the nostrils of the deceased. We see that all through. In fact, you go to the representation of Pakal's tomb today in Mexico City in the Museo Nacional, and you will see a number of examples there of breath beads with the deceased. So here's what it says in Mosiah chapter 2, verse 21. That God is preserving you from day to day by lending you breath. It's a gift of God that actually gives you your breath, and that's what ends up giving you life. Bells ring as we're going through the text here, and we're seeing what look to be interesting elements of Mesoamerican thought right here in the text of the Book of Mormon. Now, here's where it starts getting very interesting. Alma chapter 32. This is the famous passage on faith, that you planted a seed in your heart. But what eventually happens to that seed? It grows up to become a tree.
A tree.
And here's what it says in verse 41. And behold, it shall be a tree springing up unto everlasting life. So the fact that Pakal's ancestors have become trees, they've achieved eternal life, This is saying that you plant this seed in your heart and you will become a tree, and it will bring to you everlasting life.
I'm reminded of Lehi's dream of the tree that had the fruit that was most precious.
Yes.
And that represented the greatest gift of God.
And the other thing that was interesting about that fruit in Lehi's dream was it was white above all other things that Lehi had ever seen.
Yes.
The whiteness was a resplendent. It was what the Maya iconographers would call shiny.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what it says right here in verse 42 of Alma chapter 32. Sweet above all that is sweet, and white above all that is white.
Again, it makes me think of Lehi's dream.
So this is their way of saying this is resplendent.
Perhaps indescribable by man.
Yes. And then there's this notion of the word precious, which is all through the text of the Book of Mormon. So we have Pakal. He's surrounded by many examples of preciousness, jewels, jade, things that were most precious in his culture.
Now, of course, he was buried with many items of jade, which the Maya considered the most precious object. And that green, being the color of life and creation, was most precious to them. And then many of just the carved symbols with the serpent and all that are being interpreted as being beaded or jeweled.
So here's what we read in the text of Helaman chapter 5. That ye may have that precious gift of eternal life. And we see that many times in the text, how this is the most precious thing of all,
mm-hmm.
is the fact that I can actually achieve some form of divinization. Now, there's a term that a lot of Mayan art historians and epigraphers will use in this process of becoming eternal. Becoming one with the gods.
Mm-hmm.
And that is apotheosis.
Yes.
Which literally means becoming divine. So right. Is that where Pakal's headed?
That's what he hopes to be happening to him, certainly. And he also believes, or he's telling us he believes, that his ancestors have done that and perhaps given him the path to follow. As they have done that, so will he do that. And I would imagine that his son, who took over after him, Kanbalam, I believe that he was actually finishing up all these monuments to his father, that he would hope to take that same path.
So does the Book of Mormon seem to reflect these same sorts of imagery and ideas and concepts about life and the afterlife?
Well, looking at all this, it certainly seems to. And for me, it also shows if we want to interpret something from another culture, especially something that looks sort of ancient and foreign to us, it's best to learn about that culture and put it in context, rather than just doing a real quick cursory and saying, this to me looks like X. The more we study that culture and study from people who know how to read their writings and know what they believed and what they hoped for, and also look at other examples we might see of that same bit of imagery, I think the better we'll understand what these original ancient people were trying to convey.
So death was a form of rebirth.
Yes, and for the Maya, everything was cyclical. Time was cyclical. Things would die and they would be reborn. Remember, people were kind of freaked out a while ago with 2012?
Yeah.
Well, the Maya knew that wasn't an end. It was the end of one cycle, but it was the beginning.
It was always the end of one is the beginning of the other.
Exactly.
You will go through the door and there's a new world outside of that door. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for being with us here on Discover the Book of Mormon.
Absolutely.
And let's do this again sometime.
I certainly hope we can.
Let's continue to talk about ancient America, the Book of Mormon, and how all this fits together with the worldviews that these people had thousands of years ago.
No, there's so much we could talk about.
Did horses exist in the Americas before Columbus? Why do they appear in the Book of Mormon? Join us here on Discover the Book of Mormon as we answer these and other tough questions.